go. That's it, we're in business. Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, fellow councillors. Welcome to the Planning Policy Subcommittee meeting. Before we go any further and I do any more introductions, I need to record the emergency evacuation announcement. Should we be required to evacuate the building, would you please leave the building via the nearest available exit chamber? There's one behind you. There's obviously one here where you came in. Our assembly point is in the public car park at the side of the Civic Suite. Please do not delay your evacuation to collect any belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission by the council staff. Please note this meeting will be audio recorded, and can I request you turn off or put on silent any mobile phones. Thank you. As I said, welcome to the meeting this morning. My name is Dave Sperring. Members of this committee are Councillor Stanley, Councillor Mason and Councillor Mrs Weston will be present today. The other officers from Rochford District Council we have here are Mr Dan Goodman at the end there, who is the Senior Strategic Planner, Sean Scrutton, who is the MD of Rochford District Council, and Sonia Worthington, who is the Demographic Services Officer. Just to give you an outline on this meeting, this is a meeting held in public. It is not a public meeting, which means only members of the committee may ask questions. Having said that, if there are any questions that you have concerns about by the time we've finished our negotiations or discussions, you are very welcome to report or question any of your district councillors. This committee has no authority to make final decisions. They are all made by the district council. We only make recommendations or ideas or views, but no decision is made by this small group of people. It is all down to the district council ultimately to either agree or disagree with our recommendations. I believe that's pretty much covered the issues. We'll have to go through a few of the formalities initially, and then I am guessing that most of you are here to talk about items number 7 and 8 on the agenda, so we will move that straight up to the top of the list so that you can all, if you wish to stay after that, you've discussed that point, you're very welcome. If you wish to leave after we've discussed the item in relation to gypsies and travellers, you're welcome to leave. Apologies from absence. We have apologies from Councillor George Ionu and Councillor June Lumley. Okay, thank you. Non-members attending?
Councillor Ward.
Councillor Ward, Councillor Rowe. Can I take the minutes of the meeting of the 24th of September as agreed, gentlemen? Councillors? Yes? Thank you. To receive any declarations of interest? None. Okay. We're now moving on to item number 7, which is the new local plan evidence base, South Essex Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Assessment, dated 2019. I'll pass on to Mr Goodman now to give you a brief appraisal of the situation. As you can see, these reports are quite lengthy. I'll show you the paperwork involved in some of this stuff, but up to you, Dan.
Okay, so a gypsy and traveller accommodation assessment that have been taken across the whole of Essex, and that identified some pitch needs for gypsies and travellers up to the year 2033. Because of the emerging plan periods for our both the local plan and the South Essex Joint Strategic Plan being to 2038, there was a need to revise this evidence to take into account that 5-year period at the end, whilst also taking into account that there had been some changes to the supply situation since that evidence was produced, in particular 2 new sites becoming occupied in the district. So the evidence being presented is not particularly different from that which members have already seen. However, there are slight changes to the need figures that have arisen from that piece of work. And the piece of work specifically finds that there's 18 additional pitches needed for households that meet the planning definition of a traveller, 3 additional pitches needed for households which are unknown whether they meet that definition of a traveller, and 11 additional pitches for households that are considered not to meet the definition of a traveller. The council is required to plan for all of those needs but the way in which it has to differs depending on whether or not that a particular household is considered to meet the planning definition of a traveller. And that need is phased over time, so we have a relatively high degree of need in the short term between 2016 and 2021 of 14, 2 and 9. And then across the remainder of the emerging plan period, there is a total of 7 additional pitches. I suppose that's all I was planning on saying on that item. Like I say, I mean, it is really what members have already seen, but extended across a slightly longer plan period to align with the emerging plans.
Thanks, Dan. Obviously, members, we are having to talk with other councils regarding an overall strategic plan for the whole of South East Essex, which I know Dan is also heavily involved in. But is there any questions from members that you wish to raise? Councillor Mason-Coe.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope I've chosen the right paper. It's been very difficult to pick out, which issues fit with this. But we've become aware of issues of transit sites before in this committee, and I'm still not completely clear in planning terms what they mean and how they can be controlled. In particular, I'm concerned about them becoming somehow a transit and then becoming permanent. So can the officer please explain to me, at the very least, and the rest of the committee and anybody else present, what a transit site is, where the District Council currently has thoughts over where they might be sited, the extent to which they expect them to be used, and for what periods, and how the council would consider ensuring that they don't become suddenly permanent. Thank you.
Okay, well, a transit site is really a site that would be occupied on a very short-term basis. So it's not any particular household's home base, if you like. It's a site that would be occupied on a short-term basis as that household was travelling. So it may only be occupied for a period of one night. It may be occupied for a period of 1 week. So the need for a transit site has been identified on a county-wide basis, but generally there's not considered to be a consensus that there's sufficient demand in each constituent district or borough to provide a transit site, provide several transit sites. So there is a programme of work that's beginning to start that hasn't really progressed yet at the Essex Planning Officers Association level, considering how the authorities as a whole, all the authorities in Essex, might plan for a transit site somewhere in Essex. And now, I mean, the sites would typically be managed, and therefore, exactly how long a household was entitled to stay on that site would be managed. But there's no suggestion at this stage that that there's an acute need for a transit site within Rochford District, but clearly there's a recognised need at the county level to plan for one. So whilst generally we're talking about sites that meet households' needs as a home, if you like, the need figures discussed in this report don't directly relate to the need for transit sites.
Do you want to come back, John?
I would like to come back, Chairman, because I think we're all aware that from time to time there is transit through our district. I live very close to Clements Hall, and I know within the last 9 months there have been at least 2 incursions, as I call them, and at the time of an election there was a further incursion, and there's been other incursions across the district, particularly around the Swain Park area.
Yeah.
So, to my mind, what's going to be the best, Chairman, I'd say, and this is for members to consider, obviously with officers, what's best to allow this sort of thing to happen, unauthorised occupation of land, or is it best to bite a bullet and think about a transit site you can control?
I think, John, you've hit the nail on the head there. As you know, I was heavily involved in all those incidents, so I'm fully aware of what the... I mean, we were tracking the travellers as they were going through Southend. It wasn't a question of when are they going to turn up in Rochford, it was just a question of where. So we were very aware of that. I think this is a question that we need to discuss more fully with Dan, as the planning officers, and as a council as a whole. Which policy does the council want to go down? Sean, go.
On that issue, Chairman, I mean, I think, as Dan has indicated, there is an acceptance that there may very well be a need for a transit site somewhere in Essex, and there has been an ongoing debate over some while in order to try and unpack that issue and see whether it's possible to find a suitable location for a transit site. I guess what I'd say to members is, and that's a subject that needs further discussion, I suspect that probably 11 districts in the county would absolutely be delighted if Rochford provided a transit site, because the challenge is for all of the districts in the county to try and address that issue. And if someone steps up and says, well, we'll have a transit site in Rochford, then it will become the transit site for the county. And that may not be quite what members would like in terms of the movement of those travellers around the county during the travelling period in the summer.
Go on, Jim.
Chairman, I'm sorry to say that sounds a bit like Project Fear to me. So I think the council and all the councils in this part of Essex, South Essex, and in particular under the organisation of a seller, should think seriously about what sort of transit sites provisions should be made. I think it's Project Fear to turn around and say, well, if we have one in our district, it would become one for the whole of Essex. Clearly, it needs to be wider thinking.
I take on board what you're saying, John, but I think where we're talking with the other councils about strategic developments across the whole of South East Essex, this is part of the conversation that needs to be had as how we're going to have it. We're talking to, as you know, Southend, Castle Point, Basildon, Thurrock on a regular, Brentwood on a regular basis on all sorts of other issues for future planning. And I think this is one that as a council we have to address. We can bring it up through this planning policy as a full council to decide and give some guidance to Dan in conjunction with discussions with other councils. But I think Sean has got a point that if we put our hand up, everybody else is going to take a step back. I think that is a fair point, but we need to work as an area, which is what we're doing in every other aspect of future development. This is just another aspect of that development.
Chairman, can that become a recommendation from this subcommittee?
Yeah, I have no problem with that. That we can make a recommendation to full council that we consider this. I'm sure you can put it into your plans for the future, Dan, when you have discussions with other councils and see where we go. But I think we need to discuss it at full council first to see the view of the rest of the council. Yeah? Chris, you wanted to say something?
Thank you, Chairman. The transit site sounds good, but the thing is, who's going to control it? What monies are involved in getting that transit site, and so on and so on. I mean, there is a lot. If it's between councils, then is every council going to put in some sort of value into the pot to turn around and say, yeah, the site's going to be wherever it is going to be? It could be out in Epping Forest, for goodness sake. But it could be anywhere in Essex. So that's something to come on later. I've got.
Can I just answer that one? I would suggest that if we can go down this road, we would try and incorporate Essex County Council, who have this close working relationship with the Gypsy and Traveller group. They already operate some sites in the county. One I've been to was in Colchester, where the county administer this. So I would suggest this could be a way ahead. But as I say, I think this would be subject to discussion further down the road. I mean, none of us are going to bury our heads in the sand. This has got to be addressed one way or another. It's just which format we go through. Go on,
yes,
another
thank
one.
you. Thank you, Chairman. I have asked 5 questions that I was expecting to get some answers from the officer. I sent them to Michelle as well. But that hasn't. I thought the answers.
I think you got those, haven't you, Dan?
Yeah, I think those relate to item 8 on
Right.
the agenda.
They're
Oh,
on item 8.
I beg your pardon.
Okay.
Okay.
So, unless anybody else has got any questions on this, we have a recommendation that the subcommittee resolves that the South Essex GTAA dated 2019 attached an Appendix A be noted as evidence and published on the council website. In addition, we recommend that further discussion is held at district council level to discuss potential transit sites and our views of locations within the county. No, I'm sorry, sir, this is just members only. Is that acceptable to members? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move on now to item number 8 on the agenda. Over to you again, Dan. This is the Gypsy Traveller Issues, Papers and Sustainability Appraisal, Regulation 18 consultation. Sorry.
Okay, so a decision was made by council members on the 30th of October that the priority for the strategic planning team should be the preparation of a Gypsy and Traveller issues paper, which sets out the identified challenges and options for meeting the accommodation needs of the travelling Gypsy and Traveller community in the district in the future. So the paper that has been presented to members is that paper which sets out a variety of different issues and options relating to the ways in which sites might come forward, where those sites could be, different options for how we might meet that need, and also some discussion about the types of criteria that should be used to decide whether a particular site would be suitable or not. It is accompanied by a sustainability appraisal, which is required by legislation, and that considers the sustainability in economic, environmental and social terms of the different options discussed. So I think it would be useful at this point to say that with regards to one particular site that's listed, the site along Eastwood Road, we have been advised in the last 24 hours by the agent of the landowner that they no longer consider that site available for that use. As a result, members may consider that it's appropriate to remove the site from the consultation paper. As a key test of sites coming forward is that they are deliverable, and one aspect of that is obviously availability. So moving on, the paper itself obviously it has been written on the basis of identifying the needs that Rochford District have, and that's obviously been informed by item 7's report, and broadly considering how we might go about meeting those needs, particularly in the context of Michelin's Farm and concerns about its deliverability. And therefore, our recommendation to members is that we consult the public on this paper for a period of 6 weeks, in which time members of the public will be encouraged to provide their views on the challenges and options presented, and after the consultation we can obviously consider which avenues the council thinks it's most appropriate to go down.
Can I just clarify to our visitors here today, if you're under any illusions or misunderstandings, the reason that 340-370 was on the agenda for potential sites was because the previous owner had put it forward when the council goes out for its statutory call for sites. While we were led to believe that a letter would be forthcoming from the new owner saying that he wished to withdraw this from being available, we couldn't withdraw it from the paperwork until we had written confirmation. We have now got written confirmation that he wishes this site to be withdrawn. So as it stands, that site is no longer available. So unless anybody's under, I hope that's clarified the situation to everybody. I'm sorry some of you may have come along just for that one issue, but we were in a position we couldn't withdraw it from the written statement until we had written confirmation from the new owner. So you're very welcome to stay, but I do appreciate that perhaps a lot of you have come along just for that sole purpose. I'm sorry, yeah, that is, if that is quite clear, the new owner, his agent, I have a copy of the letter here, has made it quite clear the land is no longer available for Gypsy and Travellers. Are you happy to take that recommendation, committee? John? No, just 340, 370 is withdrawn from the list of potential sites. Noted, okay? Yeah. Yeah. Chris, Dan will come back, but let them all. Yeah. No, we couldn't do anything. We were stuck. We knew we were told the letter was coming until we got it. We all knew yesterday, but there's nothing. Yeah. No, there's nothing we could do, John. We were stuck. Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah. I'll do with a drink. Yeah, could you? Yeah. Oh, it's up there, isn't it? I can't get some. Sorry, John. Okay, we're back in business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, visitors and members, can we restart the meeting? I know Councillor Stanley. Members, can we go on? Visitors, can we carry on now, please, with the meeting? Councillor Stanley, I know you've got some questions for Dan that you've submitted previously. Off you go, Dan. You've got them all there, I think.
Yep. So just to come back on these original questions. I mean, regarding the consultation of the settled community, I mean, the recommendation before members is that there's a recommendation to council that we go out to public consultation on this for 6 weeks. And obviously at that point, the wider community will be encouraged to respond to the consultation. So that is the stage at which every community will be consulted. Regarding how permission might be granted to unauthorised sites, particularly when some are in appeal, and others are perhaps restrictive on the number of pitches on their plot and similar. Well, I mean, realistically, you know, we do note that there are currently 2 appeals on travellers' sites waiting to be heard, and obviously, subsequent to this consultation, members will have to consider, which options we pursue, and if that is authorising any existing unauthorised sites that have had appeals heard, then we'll obviously have to take into account the outcomes of those appeals. And it may be appropriate to allow applications to come forward to be considered by the council on those unauthorised sites. On the basis of capacity, I mean, the capacity of sites is something that's going to need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So for for sites which are currently occupied by travellers who have no desire to expand their site would obviously have to be considered if the council decided to look at allowing additional pitches on any sites. Regarding the compatibility of this with government policy on the Greenbelt, it's true that the traveller site would ordinarily be considered an appropriate development. However, we have to take note of recent appeal decisions which have given the extent of unmet need in the district greater weight. And so we have to take a look at the options and consider whether that scale of unmet need outweighs any potential harm to the Greenbelt, and obviously that has to consider what harm would actually occur to the Greenbelt. Clearly, if we're talking about existing unauthorised sites that may have existed for a long period of time, that harm now has a degree of permanence. So there is no, I suppose, there's no. RDC are not seeking to challenge government policy, but it's obviously looking to balance competing requirements. In terms of the matters to be considered and whether this includes wastewater, clean water, and waste in general, I mean, one chapter of the report looks at the kind of criteria that could need to be considered when making some kind of appraisal of a potential site. And so if something is a material planning consideration, then obviously it will have to be looked at when the council considers its options. Issues that are not material planning considerations, and that includes potential loss of property value, could not be taken into account through any planning process. And I think that probably answers question 5 about loss of property value. Like I say, I mean, it's not been considered a material planning consideration, and therefore cannot be considered in that decision-making process. And if members have any other questions.
Do you want to come back at all? Yeah, go.
Thank you, Chairman. Where we have unauthorised sites, and obviously they're in the green belt, as we already know that, there is some feeling in the community close to those sites that they are kept in a deplorable way, and not in the way that is normally expected of a resident to behave, in as much as waste and what have you on those sites. So with this being in the settled community, as we've already mentioned, that we're going to, or try to put those sites in the settled community, what have we done to ask that community about those settled sites that we are proposing to do, about the unauthorised settled sites that are on at the moment?
Okay, so I think just on one of those points, I mean, the paper itself lists a number of options, and some of the options include authorising sites which are relatively remote from the settled community, and some of the options are clearly closer. I mean, on one point, the issues paper does consider the kinds of issues that, or the kind of facilities that sites might need to include when they come forward. And there is, similar to the transit site issue, there is a programme of work planned with the EPOA about potentially having some kind of design guide for new traveller sites. So traveller sites that come forward that are designed and laid out in the best possible way. In terms of existing sites, I mean, obviously we have to be careful what is a planning consideration and what is not. You know, I mean, typically speaking, you know, some degree of treatment of foul water does fall within the planning system, and to some degree it doesn't. And you know, if there are existing issues, then I would say that they would be treated in a different process to this one. Really, this is looking at whether or not there's a planning justification to potentially authorise some of those unauthorised sites, and at that point, you know, treatment of waste may be able to be considered, but only in proportionate detail, and obviously that has to be based on submitted details rather than necessarily experience of that site. So I suppose that's what I would say about those ones.
Can I come back, Chairman?
Yeah, but
Okay, yeah, you've answered those questions, that's
Yeah.
fine. I've just got two more, which I've thought about in between, if that's all right with
go.
you.
Yeah.
Has there been any more development to the Michelin Farm site, as this was first placed in February 2014, to develop it into a traveller site? As the council has a considerable of 9 million in its reserves and has spent this to this date, and has got this to this date, what are we going to? Are we moving towards this development with money from the council, or is this going to be just another thought that where the council's going and not making any progress to that?
Sean, perhaps you'd like to answer that.
Well, Chairman, clearly there's an allocated site at Michelin's farm, and there's currently, I believe, a planning application on that site that for business development that actually excludes the area of the Travellers site. The land, I believe, has recently changed ownership, so it's that new owner that has submitted the planning application. I guess what I'd say to members is if you feel that there is something that the council should do through its MTFS, the budget process, its capital programme, etc., then the opportunity to raise that is coming next month through the consideration of the council's budget for 2019-20, and there's an opportunity.
Just last question,
Yep.
though. When will this? Thank you very much for the literature and everything that you've done for the Travellers, and it's quite expensive as it stands. But when will the council deliver this Travellers site that we so want? Remember that consultation with the settled community should be paramount before we actually go there.
Yeah.
And also that there needs to be addressed to the government policy of settlements in a settled area, in a settled community.
So I suppose on one of the points, I mean, like I said, the recommendation to council is this goes out to public consultation for a period of 6 weeks. So at that stage, we will encourage public comment on the options that are listed. But at this stage, they are broad options, generally kind of areas for us to go down, as opposed to necessarily specific solutions. In terms of timescales, I mean, it would really depend on the options that council chose to pursue. Clearly, authorising an unauthorised site that's already occupied is a much quicker process than potentially allocating new land for a new site. So, I mean, it ultimately depends critically on the options pursued by members. As I say, I mean, authorising existing sites is potentially one solution, and that's covered in the issues paper. Whereas, allocating new land, that would require a development plan document, which is, whilst this may be the first stage in that process, would still take a considerable amount of time to put together. I suppose that's all we can say at this time, but obviously subsequent to the consultation, I think there will need to be a conversation about what has been borne out of the consultation, and what the council thinks is the most appropriate option moving forward. This is kind of an information gathering exercise, and to make the options clear, but it's not necessarily the process right now whereby one or two of those options are picked and pursued with. That's more, I suppose, for following on from the consultation at this stage.
Is the council looking for a response from the community on all the sites, or is it specifically one site?
Hang on, Chris, you've asked
Sorry.
your question.
Sorry.
You
Right.
have one answer. Now, Sean wants to add a little bit before we move on to John and to Ian.
Yes, Chairman, just from a very practical standpoint, and I'm not sure where this rumour has emerged from, if the subcommittee this morning recommends to Council that the consultation paper be published for that consultation period of 6 weeks, the consultation will be with the whole community. It won't be restricted to the traveller community. It's a consultation with all of the residents of the district. So it will be an opportunity for everyone in the community to put forward their views, whether from the settled community or the traveller community, on the issues that are set out in the paper.
Okay. Right, moving on. John? Oh, yeah, okay. Thanks, John.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, John. I think one of the issues that was raised by Chris can be easily answered in regards to the research that Essex County Council are doing in regards to Gypsy and Traveller sites, and to do their various programmes that they're looking at, which I believe will go in the Essex Design Guide, which I think will bring a lot of comfort to a lot of people, in that it will be quite prescriptive in some of the requirements, and I think the whole idea is when we look at what that guidance is going to be, it would be worthwhile bringing it in as special planning guidance within, you know, our own policy, so that when we have any Gypsy and Traveller sites that are coming forward, it will actually be prescriptive in as much as that how the site is made up, the fact that it needs to have running water, electricity, all the various issues with regard to sewage. And I believe that they are looking at how they're going to bring that forward. Can you confirm that, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Essex County Council are looking on behalf of the Essex Planning Officers Association at developing some kind of design guidance for Gypsy and Traveller sites. So at this stage, it's kind of at the scoping stage. So they're considering the kinds of issues that the design guidance would need to cover, and clearly at a point in time, once that's advanced, you know, this council could choose whether or not it wants to, you know, endorse that guidance. At this stage, it's not exactly fleshed out what will fall into that guidance and what will not, but clearly it will have some kind of advice and guidance around the layout of sites, and for example, on particularly large sites, provision of green space and things like that. So it's about exactly what is in the site that is coming forward, whereas I suppose the issues paper is looking for mostly at actually a programme of being able to bring sites forward. So yes, I mean, they are working on that. It's not yet at a stage where it resembles anything, but clearly once it's advanced to a certain point, then council can consider what's in it.
You want to come back?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important for the settled community to have comfort where we do have sites which are going to be located within the settled community or close to that settled community. And obviously, if that is going to be the case, there needs to be a great degree of comfort as far as the settled community would be with regard to a Gypsy and Traveller community or a group coming in, so that they were confident that whatever was going to be set down, they would have confidence in the fact that that site would be well managed and that it would be under that type of prescription. I think that I'm just advocating that concern that we need to take on board within our own council to make sure that comes forward.
Well, I'm sure, Ian, as soon as we have something concrete to work on, it will be discussed within the planning and or full council to ensure that it seems to make common sense that you would make sure you included that in any future approval for planning application or development. John, sorry, over to you.
Chairman, I've got 3 questions and they're in pretty diverse areas. So I wonder, do you want me to do them one at a time or trot them all out and see where we go?
Well, trot them all out, see where we go.
Okay,
We'll break
take a
them down
while.
individually.
Okay, you'll certainly have a breakdown. The first one is to ask further questions about GT1, which is otherwise known as Michelin's Farm, although I've never seen it as a farm, strangely enough.
No.
But there you are. What I'd like to understand, Chairman, from officers, and in particular I think Mr Scrutton can assist, is what issues has the council encountered, or indeed county encountered, any council encountered, with regard to delivery of that site? Because I don't understand what has gone wrong, more particularly, what has caused it not to be delivered. So when the Managing Director asks, have members got ideas, I want to know what the problem is before I can have any ideas.
Well, should we stop it there, John?
Yeah, I thought you might.
Yeah. and let Sean come back on that one.
Chairman, thank you. I'm not sure I've got any easy answers in terms of Mitchelland's Farm. I mean, clearly, in the dim and distant past, it was a site that was put forward. It was tested through the local plan process. So it was core strategy and allocations plan. It was tested through that process, and it was in principle found to be a site that could make a contribution towards traveller accommodation. There was a view, though the tests are, I think, more stringent now, there was a view that the site had the potential to be deliverable. But of course, as I think Councillor Mason is aware, Mitchelland's Farm has got a complicated and checkered history, and those of us who occasionally have gone past on the train will have seen it in all sorts of disarray over the years in terms of the materials and so on that were deposited on the site, and fires and goodness knows what. So it has got a checkered history, and there was, I think, concern about the levels of contamination on the site and what the implications that would have for deliverability and for residential accommodation. So it's changed hands now. There has been a discussion with the new landowner about the deliverability of a traveller's site there. The planning application that's been submitted to date, as I said earlier, does exclude the traveller's site from that planning application, so it doesn't prevent that from potentially coming forward. But I guess we're in a situation of having to determine whether or not there is a likelihood that a private development would take place on that site for traveller accommodation, or whether indeed there is a willingness for there to be a substantial public investment in bringing forward a publicly provided site to make a contribution towards the traveller needs in the district. So it's a complicated picture, and there's no easy answer, I think. Hope that helps.
Can I just come back on that one?
Yes, by all means, John.
I have to. I mean, of course, I'm completely aware of the history of the site, and in particular, I was on the review committee when, there was a considerable amount of time spent on considering the safety of the site as before the event and the incident and afterwards. But nevertheless, that's been some time ago. And I've been pleased that it was some time ago and there haven't been any further incidents of note. What I can't actually understand is why there have been no positive action taken by the council in this period. And that answer doesn't tell me why the council has not taken, as far as I'm aware as a member, any positive action.
Can you come back on this, Sean?
Well, only to say, Chairman, I think that's a question for the council, not necessarily for me. I'm not trying to sidestep that, but that may very well be an issue that Councillor Mason wants to raise at council in due course when this item is considered next month.
Yeah. By all means, John.
Just to clarify, win this item, you mean item 8?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I'm sure other members will join me in asking questions.
Yep.
My second question relies upon the fact that I've been on the council a long time, and there have been quite a few traveller applications for special circumstances over that time, and I know Mr. Scrutton remembers them because we've had urgent conversations just before many of them, and I don't know what I don't know is because my memory is not perfect. Is how many of those which are currently subject to temporary permission are included in this consultation? Because if they were granted for special circumstances, then they're not available as a generality necessarily for usage as a traveller site in future. In other words, once the circumstances of special circumstances have expired, then it wouldn't necessarily expect them to continue. So how many of those fall into that category?
Well, I mean, there are two temporary permissions that have been identified in this in the paper. I mean, one of them that was relatively recently determined on appeal was apportioned weight for the needs of a child on that site. But that does not mean that that need does not exist. So there is still an obligation on the council to provide for it, albeit clearly the inspector has given weight to the needs of a child in that particular case. So when the council comes to consider whether or not that site is a good site to authorise permanently, it will obviously have to consider whether or not the needs for the child was the only, if you like, the only factor in having to grant that permission. And if there are any fundamental reasons why a site in that particular location is not acceptable in planning terms. So on the other temporary site, my understanding is we have a planning application in now to extend that period, and it has only just come in, I believe. And there will obviously have to be some consideration there as to whether or not the circumstances on that site have changed, whether or not there is justification to grant temporary permission or indeed a permanent permission on that site. And that will obviously have to consider its acceptability in planning terms, and also the extent of unmet need in the district, and realistically whether or not there is an alternative site where those people, if they were refused planning permission, could go. Because if there is not, then in the likelihood of an appeal situation, we are likely to again have to consider arguments about whether unmet need is outweighs the need, outweighs any harm to the greenbelt. So in both those cases, my understanding is temporary permissions were granted partly on the basis that inspectors considered it was realistic that that Michelin's Farm may have been delivered by the end of that temporary period, and therefore may allow the residents on that site alternative accommodation at the end of that expiry. Clearly, if we do not expect Michelin's Farm to be delivered at the end of that expiry, then we will have to consider whether or not or how we can provide alternative accommodation for those existing households, and whether or not that includes granting them permanent consent. So I'm not aware of any temporary permissions other than those two, but it may be that they now fall within the category of unauthorised if those temporary permissions have expired. And in which case, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that clearly the council will need to look at its options, and if it considers that authorising unauthorised sites is a good option, it will need to consider those sites on a site-by-site basis. And if there are fundamental reasons why the circumstances on that site mean it is not suitable for a permanent permission, then it will have to obviously consider that. But at this stage, they are listed as options, and I suppose areas for consideration. But I suppose officers at this point have not given too much detailed analysis into the specifics about each of those listed sites. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I understood all of that. Clearly, the lack of positive action on GT1 Michelin's Farm is a particular issue that the council will have to come to grips with in a planning sense. But if we're having a consultation with the public, those are material factors as to whether they might or might not see those as appropriate extensions of permanent travellers' sites. And I would expect that the consultation to draw attention to that. Otherwise, you can't get a meaningful consideration by the public either. So, I'm not happy that there are two in there where there are certain circumstances already applying, which the public need to know about to be able to consider them as to whether they consider they should become permanent. So that's an issue for the subcommittee to consider, because it's material. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
I'm glad.
Just thinking, John, that while I fully appreciate what you're saying, I'm not quite sure that the public would have the expertise to understand the implications of some of these things that you're saying. It would just be, well, no or yes. While you and officers may understand the intricacies, you are asking members of the public who don't have our in-depth background to some of this to comment on issues that they may not realise the implications of some of the situations. Do you want to?
I think you've misunderstood me, Chairman. I'm going to come back to you. I think the public need to know that there are temporary permissions and they are special circumstances. I wouldn't expect it to go any further.
Chairman, if it helps, we could add a note into the paper that gives the current planning status of unauthorised sites. If that would help in terms of the.
Okay, fine. Sorry, I'm sorry, John, if I misunderstood what you said. Yeah, no, hang on, Ian. Go on, John.
Is it on this particular site? It's on this particular site.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Thank you very much.
This sounds more and more like Parliament. Let's
Yeah,
not
it does.
get.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
We must have a backstop.
I appreciate the members giving way to me. Thank you. On that point, I think the point that John was trying to allude to was the original point that came up in TR9, where, as far as that particular site was concerned, the owner had withdrawn permission for that site to be used. So now, even though it's on that paper, that will need to be withdrawn. I think John was possibly alluding to the fact that there are sites on here still which need to have further notation on, which may or may not come forward, because I noticed Michelin's Farm is on there as well, and that may not come forward. So it may not be an option, even though it's in here. There needs to be something set aside that changes are possible, that this site may not be available. I think that is maybe, at a guess, what you were trying to allude to.
It wasn't, but I'm happy to see the extension to that.
So, before we go on to your last point, John, perhaps we can put some wording in here to cover these aspects. That the items that have been raised in this meeting should be reflected in the recommendations to full council. Yeah? Okay, John, you've got one more.
Thank you. Good job. I said it was three.
Yeah, I've been counting.
No. Lucky I've been around long enough. I've got to talk to you about TRA12, which is an option site within this paper. I have to talk about it because the landowner has been in touch with me, and I've got to say privately, because I wasn't entirely sure of the status of the communication. With TRA12, which is otherwise in my ward of Corporal West, and it's called Green Acres, the owner has written to me and said it is not our intention for the site to be used for travellers. And that's as far as I want to divulge, but I think it's entirely appropriate for me to say that on his behalf. He can't be here for other reasons. So the council needs to bear that in mind. I suppose the second question is going to follow, which says, I take it then, and I shake of the head or a nod of the head is appropriate, I take it then that landowner has not withdrawn TRA12. Fine. The second part goes on because residents have already looked at this paper and have looked at the detailed map. In particular on TRA12, they are saying it's been taken from a very old map and it's inaccurate. Okay. So what I would like to have ensured is every single one of those maps is checked for detail against the call for sites, because residents are indicating that may not be correct in TRA12 and maybe others.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, I think if there's no other questions, I think we can pretty much go down, if subject to members' approval, that the subcommittee recommends to council that Gypsy and Traveller issues paper and an accompanying sustainability appraisal as attached at Appendix A and B, respectively, be published for formal publication consultation for 6 weeks, subject with the recommendations and approvals, which I know Sonia has made a note of, be included in the recommendations. Members agreeing with that? I think you've got all the bits and pieces, and that will be the further recommendation with the additions on. Okay? Thank you very much. Okay. Right, we'll go back to agenda items now. Back onto agenda item 5, which is the local plan, local development scheme 2018-2021. Over to you, Dan.
Yep. So this is another revision to our local development scheme. As members will no doubt be aware, by now we are required to keep an up-to-date timetable for plan making. This reflects revisions to the timetable, including the addition of a timetable for obviously the consultation we've just discussed, and a potential timetable for further iterations on this subject to any decision by council. It largely retains the already agreed timetables for the South Essex Joint Strategic Plan and the local plan, but clearly if there are changes agreed or suggested to those, then we will present that back to members in a later subcommittee. And so the recommendation to members of the subcommittee is that it's recommended to council that this revised LDS is adopted. And I believe that it is nearly almost identical to the one that is already agreed, just adding those additional areas which I have noted.
Okay, members, are there any questions on this? I think Dan's pretty much explained it. Unless you've got anything, yeah, Chris, go.
Thank you, Chairman. I realise that we're the local plan of sites for development, but have we taken into consideration the timescale of how the local plan is developing, in as much as sites that have now been allocated for development will take us probably way up to 2025, 2030, the way the sites are working out. And before we actually allocate any more sites, let's make sure that we are getting those developed in the timescale that we want, rather than exceeding onto the timescale.
As far as I'm aware, Chris, this is an issue that we've raised even with our MP, to try and expedite the approved sites already. Now, you know as well as I do that we cannot force developers to move any quicker than we would like them to. We would love them to have brought the land in. We have very limited powers, as you're aware, to actually force them to move quicker than they want to, providing they meet their criteria, the periods and bits and pieces. It is a very frustrating situation, but that doesn't take away the need that we still have as a council to keep producing the 5-year plans. It's as simple as that. We'd love to be, as far as I'm aware, unless I've got this wrong, Sean, to be forcing some of these developers to move faster than they would, but they're not. You know, they're sitting on land the same as we do. And while I have sympathy for your comments, I don't quite know how we're going to force them to move faster. But as I say, we still need to move our requirements for the 5-year plan. And do you want to come in, Sean, on that, or is that summed it up pretty reasonably?
Yeah, no.
Go on, John. Yes.
I'd like to kind of follow up on that.
Yep.
Because there are sites that seem to have stalled. They don't seem to have got to planning permission and been delayed, yet alone got to the very first step. Does that mean that there's a possibility that those sites, those allocations of sites formal allocation of sites could be removed in this new plan? In other words, they are a gap. Could we, I mean, I won't talk about particular sites because this is not an appropriate place, but if we know that a landowner is not going to bring it forward, we know they're not going to bring it forward, can we just take it out?
I'm not, Chairman, I'm not sure I'm aware of any of the allocated sites that are not in the process of being discussed for development. I think the difficulty is that the development process is in principle quite simple if it's one single landowner and they get a developer involved and they submit a planning application. Unfortunately, some of the sites that are allocated are a little bit more complicated than that, have multiple ownerships, and there is a need for those owners to reach an agreement and an accommodation with the developer and between themselves indeed. So I'm not aware of any sites that are not subject to discussions about bringing them forward for development, but it does take longer sometimes than the council would like, and that is a risk when one's looking at 5-year supply and so on.
Yeah.
So we've set out in our allocation of sites in 2014 that we have an expectation of sites delivering over certain time periods and blocks of 5 years. So if they don't, then that's a gap. Does that also mean that other sites that are further into the future can actually turn around to us and say, deliver mine now?
That's a good point, Chairman, and I think we've accepted that principle already in relation to, for example, Hullbridge, where I think there was potentially 2 phases of development there. So we've accepted the principle that planning application can be granted across that whole site. I think that the risk that any local authority has if a site takes longer to come forward for development than anticipated is an argument around 5-year supply and whether or not, in order to stop that gap, other sites have got to be identified in order to ensure that there is a continuing 5-year supply of development. But as members will be aware, that is an immensely complicated process in a Greenbelt district where the NPPF indicates clearly that sites should only be brought forward through a local planning process, through an allocation process. And that seems to be the view that has generally been adopted by the government. So it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
Just to follow up, so during this new plan, which we're talking about, then if at preferred options, certain sites become, or areas, if not sites, become more likely to proceed to allocation, then we could see where there are gaps in our current plan that emerging sites can take that place, where there's a greater keenness or greater ability for the site to be delivered. In other words, new sites could end up, we've not even discussed yet, could end up in an emerging plan and literally leapfrog the lot because of gaps in our own delivery scheme.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in principle, but I'm not. I tend to think that's probably unlikely, and certainly I don't think it would be practical to consider the notion that a site that's currently allocated for housing is unlikely to progress and would be removed from a plan because there are likely to be compensation issues arising from that if the council sought to try and take that decision.
All I'll say, Chairman, and it's on the record because there are developers out there who think with their new sites that are in the current call for sites that they can bring them forward fairly quickly. I was trying to understand within this orderly process how that could happen.
Excuse me, can
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to speak. Can I just say one thing to the council, not to the councillor, that I wrote various letters to Rochford District Council, and I was told over the phone that you don't answer written letters, which at my age was horrifying. So I hope they'll take a note of that in future. I did get in touch with Mark Francois, and he was also horrified. Thank you very much.
Chairman, if it helps, from the Managing Director, the Council does answer letters in writing, so if you've been given that information, I can only apologise.
Chairman, could I interject there? There is an issue where if residents write in on a planning application, the council doesn't reply to them. But it makes it clear that it doesn't reply to objections, support or observations on planning applications.
Chairman, to go back to the point at hand, I'm conscious of the fact that there are very keen landowners who may very well have submitted representations through the call for sites, who would love their sites to be developed for housing, and they will absolutely put forward through their agents an argument that says, hey, look, our site's here, it's fantastic, we can bring this forward and we can solve all your problems. And I'm here to say, Chairman, that those people should be sadly disappointed. The issue for the council is that we plan properly for development in the district, and that means that the council has to consider the appropriate policies and allocations through the plan making process, and that includes now the joint strategic plan, and that is the process. And I think I think the council should rightly resist the notion that an enthusiastic owner of a green belt site should somehow or other at this juncture take precedence over allocated sites or the plan making process.
Chairman, that is a very important statement made by the Managing Director, which I hope is reproduced in the minutes, because there's a message there for these developers who are worrying my residents, and this will assist. Thank you.
I'm sure Sonia has got it in the minutes and it will be made available to members.
Can I just ask one question?
Very quick, Chris. Yeah, because we've had this one to death.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. With these, many of these sites, and the parcels of land will be owners, or the owner of the parcels of land will be the developer. Could we find, and this is a question to the council, could we find ourselves with parcels of land owned by developers and not developing in the next 15 years? Because if we're going to continue with our 5-year plan of this site is open, or this site is allocated to build on to a developer, we could find the next 15 years with all these sites, I don't know how many sites we do every 5 years, whether it's be 2 sites or 1 site per 5 years, we could find ourselves with a lump of lands out there with no development on at all. And we should, this is the point what I think is being raised by Councillor Mason, is that if we've got sites that a developer wants to develop and can bring it forward quicker than those ones that we've already passed, should we not be looking at them to facilitate that?
I think Mr. Scrutton's just answered that one quite clearly. No, he said no. We've just gone through that in relation to John's question. Okay. The recommendation is that the draft local development scheme 2018-2021 attached to Appendix A be adopted. Yep. Agreed? Thank you. And last but not least, item number 6, the new local plan evidence-based South East Essex Strategic Growth Locations Assessment 2019. Over to you, Dan.
Okay, so this piece of work is a piece of joint evidence that's been prepared with officers from Southend and Castle Point councils. So at this stage, it's looking. It looked across South East Essex for areas which were considered to have potential for what's been defined as strategic scale growth. So strategic scale growth is in the order of 6,000 to 10,000 homes, possibly more than that, but as a kind of filter for the purposes of this assessment. And it's the scale of growth that's considered to be able to deliver meaningful improvements to infrastructure, things like new secondary schools, meaningful road improvements and things like that. So the purpose of the assessment was really just to look across South East Essex to see whether there was any potential capacity for development of that scale. It has not considered the specific capacity or the specific infrastructure requirements of that level of growth. If this is an avenue that the council goes down, then obviously those kind of considerations will have to come later. But broadly, the conclusions of the assessment were that the only sector in the study area which was considered to have capacity for strategic scale growth was Sector D, which is I think has been called the land north of Fossett's Farm and Garrans Park. So to the east of Rochford and west of Great Wakering. It includes land within both Rochford's administrative boundary and Southend's administrative boundary, and has been considered. All the sectors have been considered against various high-level constraints, things like European environmental designations, instead of the more detailed constraints that a later piece of work would look at. So the purpose of this stage really is to provide an initial piece of evidence suggesting one potential option that may warrant further exploration. It's not in any way, shape, or form a decision being made by the council on the merits or otherwise of development in that area. It is just, like I say, a piece of evidence to inform where I suppose the direction of travel in plan making in this area.
John.
Thank you, Chairman. I think this was singly the most interesting paper amongst the collection. The first question is I think Sean can probably answer this one. Sector D sounds remarkably like the area that Iceni and Seaside put forward, best part of 10 years ago for 20,000 houses on the borders, if not straddling it, between Rochford District and Southend. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to go into whether they're going to reappear, but they might. The second question relates to obviously what Mr. Goodman just said, which reflected in the report, is that this could relate to a development of between 6,000 and 10,000 houses, which very loosely equates to a garden community, which of course has featured in our issues and options consultation of 1718. I also know from looking at our key decisions document that there was to be a number of councils, including this council, were to consider whether a request of government for consideration of garden communities would have been made last November, because the government has indicated, I believe, that it wishes to know what ambitions there are for that, because there are grounds to expect the government to participate in infrastructure. To the extent to which Sector D has now been identified, can I ask, has a seller or this council missed the boat?
Chairman, in relation to that particular item, there was a bid process. In fact, the advice that a seller received was that we were a bit early in terms of a bid. There is a notion across South Essex, certainly leave aside South East Essex. There's certainly a notion elsewhere in South Essex that new garden community or communities is something that that should be examined as an option, and but the advice was that we were probably too early in terms of bidding, so we submitted an expression of interest just to ensure that next time out when there's a further bidding round, we hopefully will get an opportunity to submit a bid to government for some resources to help that process.
To sum up, Chairman, then this is as an option, and purely an option with constraints, that it's a possibility for a garden community in Rochford District as part of the new local plan.
I don't quite know whether we can go with that one, John. Not because I'm being particularly negative, but I'm not quite sure how we can project that. That's what we've got.
I said
here.
an option. Is it not an option? If it's not an option for that, then it's not an option for anything. It's just a waste of paper, because it either is an option within our new local plan as a garden community with the support of government in a scheme, or it's a waste of paper.
But we've got the recommendations, and the area is already highlighted in the report. This is the very early tentative stage, and there's no reason why it can't be progressed as part of the overall conversations. Go on, Sean.
So, Chairman, this is just nothing more than an evidence-based document, and what I'd say to members is there is a process. In a sense, there's two processes. There's the council's own local plan process, but of course the council signed up to the Association of South Essex Local Authorities and to the principle of preparing a joint strategic plan. And I think the intention is that later in the year there will be an issues and options paper emerging as part of that joint strategic plan working. And as I think the council's own issues and options paper flagged, there is an option of looking at new garden settlement, call it what you will. And I think that that's something that will come certainly through the strategic view and strategic issues and options consultation of from the JSP, and of course this is deposited as an evidence base to that.
On the plan that we've just approved under item 5, we are due to produce as a council the preferred options in October of this year. Surely, if this is at all an interest or a potentially viable option, we would expect it to be developed to either be included or excluded from preferred options.
Chairman, if I may, the expectation is that the issues and options for the JSP will be considered prior to us getting to the point of doing further work. So there will be a lead, a strategic lead, and we'll reflect that in our.
So the next time I hear about this would be in the JSP issues and options around the spring, if it's at all likely to be a viable option. Correct?
Correct.
Correct. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Otherwise, we have 2 recommendations here, which I think, bearing in mind the comments that both Sean and John have said, that can be reflected in the minutes. Yeah. The recommendations are that the South East Essex Strategic Growth Locations Assessment attached at Appendix A be noted as an evidence-based document and published on the Council's website. And number 2, that the Office continues to work with Southend and Castle Point Borough Councils under the duty to cooperate to continue to address the cross-boundary issues which may have legal and soundness implications for Rochford's plan making. With, again, as we've said, the comments that both Councillor Mason and Mr Scrutton have made included in the minutes.
Could I suggest, Chairman, that it might be worth just referencing the fact that that's also part of the Association of South Essex Local Authorities, so there's a bigger picture reflected in that as well. So it's not just Castle Point, it's not just Castle Point and Southend.
There's a very real need
I think
for the public to understand how this fits together.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm having a struggle, which is why I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay, members, thank you very much. Unless we have Item 9, sorry.
Sorry, I wondered if you were going
Yes.
to throw that to me.
Item 9. Sorry, item 9. Turn over. Item 9. Right, sorry. Issues and occupancy document, feedback report. Sorry, Dan. The most important one we've been talking about for weeks. Over to you.
Okay, so this is slightly belatedly, a feedback report has been produced to summarise upon the issues and options consultation that was held between December and March, March of 2018. So the council is required to put together a feedback report to help discharge regulations in the town and country local planning regulations. And when a plan is submitted for examination, we would be expected to reproduce evidence and a statement of how people were consulted at each stage and how those people were consulted. So that's one of the purposes of this report. And the other is obviously to provide any interested parties with a way of seeing what comments have been received and an initial officer response. Obviously, to some degree, a lot of the issues and comments were around matters that will become clearer as the council progresses with its plan making. So it's not always been possible to give a conclusive response at this stage, but it has been an initial response based on current information has been given in each case, and it has been split up into various chapters based on the type of respondent. So if an interested party is particularly interested in looking at how certain organisations or individuals have responded, they can do so, and it also splits the topics up into the chapter of the issues and options document to which they related, as well as providing some additional information about how residents and businesses and consultees were engaged with, and some statistics around how many responded and how. And the recommendation to council is that this is noted, it forms a part of the wider local plan evidence, and can be published on the council's website.
Thank you, Dan. Members, any questions on this? John?
If I may. Yes, it was very interesting reading, albeit later than we would have liked, and I think that's been recorded well by the subcommittee anyway, but we need just to acknowledge that so the public don't think that we were completely comfortable with the fact that there's been a long delay. It's obviously appropriate in the process to ensure that the evidence is properly recorded in the evidence base, but I think I'm more interested in what will happen to it in the future, because there's some interesting preferences, views given by public stakeholders and other organisations. What I'd like to be assured of is that this just won't simply be recorded, but through the rest of the process, including proceeding to preferred options, we do actually look back on it and ensure that we comply with it. It sounds a bit like Brexit, but actually it's a microcosm of how stakeholders, which are ultimately the residents, get to influence the final decision. And we have in this microcosm a quite large decision locally about our local plan, new local plan, over something like another 20 years. So can Mr Goodman or Sean assure me that this is a dynamic document and it will be used at every stage of the process to inform what the council seeks to put forward as recommendations or intentions in the next stages? If we don't, it becomes totally valueless. And I've got to honestly say to you, as you all know through your post bags, residents don't think we listen. This time, and we've said this several times, and the chairman said it several times, we've got to demonstrate that we are. And the way to demonstrate it is ensure that it's referenced through the future of the process.
Well, I think I can answer that, John. I don't think neither you nor I will allow this not to happen. I think it's as simple as that.
It had to be said, Chair.
Had to be said, but I say, we've had this conversation repeatedly through the process. It's there, it's evidence-based, and yes, it should be used. Councillor Ward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. I would like to thank the officers. This has been a very, very good piece of work, which, as John has quite rightly said, it should enable us to draw on what our residents have wanted within their own minds, how they see. I know it's a very complicated process, the planning process, but what we have tried to do as far as our residents are concerned is to give them the choices that are really deep-rooted within them, which are probably fundamentally within the infrastructure, the facts where there is lack of infrastructure, that their needs. And I think where we're taking any plan forward, any needs forward, we need to actually reference what is in here so we can actually draw and show that we have actually taken instructions to some extent from this document, and I think that's very, very important to give our residents confidence that when any other issues and options and any other documents go out to them, it's not going to be a feeling they're going to end in a bin. These are actually going to be used, and I think we need to make sure our residents understand we want to reference their views.
Well, I'm sure that, you know, we as councillors will make sure that this is endorsed. I have no problem with that at all. So the recommendation, Chris, sorry, I'm afraid only members can ask questions. Go on, Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. The overall, from what I hear, the overall thing is that from residents is their concerns are not taken so much into consideration in the way of, you know, I know we've got planning policies and what have you, but 90% of the people out there, out of the office of the Rochford District Council, don't believe that they're taken into consideration and what their views are. And I mean, I agree with the outline that we've just spoke about, but we need to emphasise that we do care for what they say and we do take notice, and to prove that we do, we need to publicise that proof. More so now than anything else, because of what's going on in the district completely. Because I feel that some of them.
But Councillor Stanley, that's our job. We're councillors.
Yes.
That's what we should be doing.
Yes.
We should be representing our residents. We should be making sure that their feelings and views are projected to whatever issue it be. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. The only area that you sometimes run into problems is where technicalities and planning and other issues, to a degree, tie our hands in what we can actually enforce, propose, action. But the principle of reflecting residents' views, that's a fundamental part of being councillor. I have no problem with that at all.
That's exactly what is required of us, if you like.
Yeah, definitely.
I quite agree. But as you say, there are rules, there are regulations that we have to go by, and the council has to go by, which many a time I've had conversations with Mike Stranks on several planning issues, and believe you me, he's explained it. But the resident doesn't quite. I mean, I do broadcast that to the resident that's involved, but they still don't see why or what for's. You know.
And I go back again. That is for us as councillors to talk to them, to see residents, to discuss issues, and if necessary, explain it in detail. But at the end of the day, we have been elected to represent their views, and that's what we should do.
That's what we should. Yeah. Thank you.
Last one, Mr. Ward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think in regards to the point you just made, I think a good explanation not only as to why we can do things, but actually as to why we can't do things. There are certain things that we just can't do, no matter, you know, what they want us to do. There are certain prohibitions, I guess, that stop us. And I think we need to be plain and honest with our own residents. We need to tell them the facts and not be afraid to tell them the facts.
Thank you. Okay, members. Well, the recommendation for this item is that the issues and options feedback report is noted as an evidence-based document and published on the council's website. We agreed? Thank you. Can I just thank Sean, Sonia, and particularly Dan for his efforts in compiling all these reports today, and we'll close the meeting at 11:01. Thank you very much.